The city of East Berlin and the nation it governed moved on, burying the inconsistency under layers of ideology. That is, until the wall itself came crashing down. The eventual unsealing of the Stasi archives would reignite the cold embers of the case, revealing a conspiracy of betrayal that reached the highest echelons of power. The person who pulled the trigger was not a dissident or a spy from the West. It was someone who had stood beside Anja Schmidt in countless briefings, someone who had placed a consoling hand on her husband's shoulder at her state funeral, someone who had personally overseen the sham investigation into her death. This story exposes the rot at the core of a system built on secrets, where the greatest threat was not the enemy you could see, but the brother you trusted. Anja Schmidt was a true believer. At 38, she was the embodiment of the new socialist generation, a woman who had risen through the ranks of the Stasi not through connections, but through sheer intellect and unwavering loyalty. Born in the ruins of Dresden, she had dedicated her life to the protection of the Republic. She held a doctorate in psychology from Humboldt University and spoke fluent Russian and English. Her colleagues in Directorate 12, responsible for counter-espionage, regarded her with a mixture of awe and fear. Anja didn't just analyze intelligence. She inhabited it. Understanding the motivations of the Western agents, she hunted with an almost supernatural empathy. Captain Rolf Becker, who worked under her for 5 years, remembered her intensity. She saw patterns others missed. A misplaced comma in a coded transcript, a slight deviation in a target's routine. To her, these were not details, they were confessions. Her commitment was total, but she was not the cold automaton of Western propaganda. Anja was a wife and mother. She and her husband, Stefan, a professor of engineering, lived in a privileged but modest apartment in Pankow. Their only son, 10-year-old Lucas, was the center of her world. She would leave the paranoia and shadows of her work at the door, spending her evenings helping Lucas with his homework and reading him stories of socialist heroes. She believed in the state, in the system, Stefan would recall decades later. She believed it was a flawed but necessary shield against the decadence and aggression of the West. She thought she was on the right side of history. But Anja's defining characteristic was an integrity that bordered on ideological purity. In early 1984, her investigation into a security leak had uncovered negligence that led back to a well-connected party official. Despite pressure from her superiors to drop the matter, Anja persisted, presenting an irrefutable dossier that resulted in the official's quiet removal. This earned her a reputation as someone who placed the security of the state above even the careers of its powerful servants. Most recently, she had been tasked with a highly sensitive internal audit, codenamed Operation Cassiopeia. The official purpose was to identify weaknesses in communication protocols with KGB liaisons in Moscow. But Stefan knew she was troubled. She had been working late, sequestered in her home study with documents she kept under lock and key, a breach of protocol she would never normally risk. The night before she was killed, she had a brief, tense phone call. Stefan overheard only a snippet as he passed her study. The discrepancy is confirmed. We must meet. The usual place. The crime scene was an exercise in sterile precision. Major Schmidt was discovered by a police patrol at 6:15 a.m. Her Lada was parked on a desolate service road, a spot known to Stasi officers for clandestine meetings. The engine was cold. The doors were locked from the inside, except for the driver's door, which was slightly ajar. Her seatbelt was unfastened. The official report noted the absolute lack of disruption. Her briefcase, containing vetted and unimportant documents, sat on the passenger seat. Her state identification and personal effects were untouched. The cause of death was a single 9 by 18 mm Makarov round, fired from directly behind her, the muzzle pressed against the base of her skull. The medical examiner's report, later heavily redacted, estimated the time of death between 10 p.m. and midnight. Her service pistol had not been fired. Its magazine was full. The radio in her vehicle was on but tuned to an unmonitored frequency, something a professional like Anja would never do. Forensics teams scoured the car and the surrounding area. They found Anja's fingerprints on the steering wheel, the gear shift, and the door handle. But the rest of the car was eerily clean, as if wiped down. No foreign prints, no fibers, no footprints in the damp soil beside the road. The bullet casing was missing, expertly collected by the killer. The bullet itself, retrieved from her skull, was standard issue, identical to the ammunition used by every officer in the Stasi and the People's Police. The news of a Stasi major's assassination sent a shockwave through the insulated corridors of power. This was not the work of a common criminal. This was a direct challenge to the state. Within hours, Stasi chief Erich Mielke himself ordered the formation of a special commission to investigate the murder. He appointed Colonel Klaus Richter to lead it. The choice was logical, almost inevitable. Richter, a 55-year-old veteran of the organization, was a legend. A decorated officer who had been with the Stasi since its inception, he was Anja's longtime mentor and commanding officer. He had recruited her from the university, guided her career, and treated her like the daughter he never had. At the initial briefing, Richter's face was a mask of cold fury. "Major Schmidt was one of our finest," he told the assembled investigators, his voice resonating with authority. "She was a bulwark against the forces that seek to undermine our republic. Her murder is an act of war. We will find the Western dogs responsible, and we will make them pay." Behind the scenes, the atmosphere was thick with paranoia. Had MI6 or the CIA finally managed to penetrate their ranks so deeply they could assassinate a major on her own soil? The investigation officially focused outwards. Known dissidents were rounded up and subjected to brutal interrogations. Western diplomats were placed under even heavier surveillance. But privately, a darker suspicion took hold. The sheer professionalism of the killing, the intimate knowledge of Stasi procedure, the choice of a known meeting spot, it all pointed inwards. Anja had let her killer into the car, or had at least allowed them to approach without fear. She knew them. She trusted them. The investigation moved with ruthless speed, but it was a carefully choreographed performance. Richter's team interviewed dozens of Anja's colleagues. They analyzed her case files, all except the sealed documents from Operation Cassiopeia, which Richter declared too sensitive for review. Stefan was questioned for hours, his grief dissected for any sign of complicity. He told them about her late nights, her worried demeanor, and the phone call. His words were noted and then ignored. 3 weeks into the investigation, Richter announced a breakthrough. A known dissident, a writer named Jürgen Hess who had been previously imprisoned for anti-state activities, had been identified as the killer. The official story was that Hess, working on behalf of a West German intelligence agency, had lured Major Schmidt to the park under the pretense of providing information, only to assassinate her. The evidence was flimsy. A partial footprint near the scene that vaguely matched Hess's boot, a neighbor who claimed to have seen him out late that night. Hess was arrested in a pre-dawn raid. He was never seen again. His family was informed he had died of a heart attack while attempting to escape custody. The case was officially closed. Anja Schmidt was given a hero's funeral with full state honors. Colonel Richter himself delivered the eulogy, his voice breaking as he spoke of her brilliance and sacrifice. He presented the folded flag of the GDR to her son, Lucas, and promised him his mother's death would never be forgotten. It was a lie. The case was deliberately buried, a loose end tied off with the life of an innocent man. But in the quiet apartment in Pankow, 10-year-old Lucas held the flag and looked at the man who had been like an uncle to him, the man his mother had trusted completely. And even at that age, he felt a sliver of cold doubt, a question that would lie dormant for years, waiting for a wall to fall. As the 1980s drew to a close, the German Democratic Republic began to crumble from within. For Lucas Schmidt, the years following his mother's death were a disorienting journey through the looking glass of a dying state. He grew up as the son of a martyr, a title that afforded him certain privileges, a place in the best schools, an exemption from the harshest rigors of military service. But it was a gilded cage. The official narrative of his mother's heroism was taught in his history classes, a sanitized paragraph in a textbook about the eternal struggle against Western imperialism. But the official story never settled right. It felt brittle, like the cheerful propaganda posters that peeled from the city's concrete walls. His father, Stefan, became a ghost in their own home. A brilliant engineer reduced to a shell, he navigated his life with a quiet, heartbreaking caution. He never spoke of Anja's work again, and whenever Lucas tried to ask questions about the night she died, a curtain of fear would fall over his father's eyes. "It is better not to know," he would say, his voice barely a whisper. In this country, knowledge is a burden. The state's suffocating embrace was a constant reminder. Colonel Richter remained a fixture in their lives, a benevolent, watchful guardian. He would visit on Anja's birthday and the anniversary of her death, bringing expensive Western coffee for Stefan and books for Lucas. He ensured Lucas was accepted into the prestigious youth wing of the party, the Free German Youth, and spoke of a promising future for the boy within the security apparatus. "Your mother would be so proud," Richter would say, placing a heavy hand on Lucas's shoulder. The touch always made Lucas's skin crawl. The man's sympathy felt rehearsed, his grief a performance. Lucas learned to play his part, to nod and smile, and show the appropriate deference to the man who had been his mother's mentor. But in the privacy of his room, he would study the single photograph he kept of his mother, a candid shot from a family vacation to the Baltic Sea a year before she died. In it, she was not the stern Stasi major, but just his mother, laughing, her face open and free. He searched her eyes for answers she could no longer give. The world changed on November 9th, 1989. The Berlin Wall fell. For Lucas, then 14, it was as if the world had split open. The city erupted in a chaotic, joyous festival of reunion. The symbols of the state he had been raised to revere were torn down, its leaders ridiculed. The certainties of his young life dissolved overnight. His father wept, not with joy, but with a profound, disoriented sorrow. Their entire world, the sacrifices they had made, the beliefs they had held, it had all been built on a foundation of lies, propped up by a wall of concrete and fear. The fall of the GDR was followed by the equally monumental process of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with the past. In 1991, the unified German government passed the Stasi Records Act, opening the vast, meticulous archives of the Ministry for State Security to the public. Millions of ordinary citizens lined up for the chance to see their files, to learn who among their friends, neighbors, colleagues, and even family members had been spying on them. For Lucas, it was a terrifying and irresistible opportunity. He was now a university student, studying history, driven by a need to understand the system that had shaped and broken his family. In 1992, he formally applied to see his mother's files. The process was arduous. The files of Stasi officers, especially those in sensitive departments like counter-espionage, were the last to be processed. But his status as her son gave him a unique claim. After a wait of nearly 2 years, in the spring of 1994, he received a summons. He found himself in a sterile, modern reading room in the former Stasi headquarters, the same building his mother had walked into every day. A clerk wheeled a cart to his table, laden with gray cardboard folders. They contained his mother's life, reduced to reports, commendations, and surveillance transcripts. He spent weeks poring over the documents. He read her psychological profiles of Western agents, her operational plans, her performance reviews, all signed off by her superior, Colonel Klaus Richter. He saw the official report on her murder, a thin file filled with inconsistencies and fabrications. He read the sham investigation that led to the arrest of Jürgen Hess, the dissident writer. The file contained Hess's signed confession, the handwriting erratic, the signature a barely legible scrawl. A separate medical report noted Hess's death from circulatory failure. It was a lie, neat and tidy. But the archives were not perfect. They were a shattered mirror, reflecting a fragmented truth. The files for Operation Cassiopeia, the internal audit she was working on when she was killed, were missing. Purged, it was a dead end, another wall. His father had been right. Knowledge was a burden. Defeated, Lucas prepared to abandon his search. Before he left, he requested his mother's personal effects, which had been held in Stasi evidence storage for years. The clerk brought him a single box. It contained her wallet, her keys, a worn copy of Goethe's poetry, and her state-issued fountain pen. There was nothing of value. That night, back in his small student apartment, he examined the items one last time. He idly unscrewed the barrel of the fountain pen. It felt unusually heavy. Inside, nestled where the ink cartridge should have been, was a tiny, tightly rolled piece of film. A microdot. It was a technology his mother had specialized in, a relic of the spy craft of a bygone era. Getting it developed and magnified required finding someone with the right equipment and the discretion to ask no questions. He found an old photographer in Kreuzberg, a man who had worked for the West German press during the Cold War and understood the value of secrets. When the image was finally projected onto a screen, Lucas felt the air leave his lungs. It was a single page, a summary of her final report for Operation Cassiopeia. It was the phone call her father had overheard. The discrepancy is confirmed. We must meet. It hadn't been to Richter. It had been to her Russian contact. But Richter, the master of surveillance, must have been listening. He must have known she was closing in. So he arranged his own meeting first. The secluded road in Treptower Park. He had used her trust as a weapon, luring her to her death to protect his treason. For Lucas, the revelation was a seismic shock. The man who had shaped his youth, who had posed as his family's guardian, was the monster who had murdered his mother. But this was 1995. The world had moved on. Klaus Richter, like many former high-ranking Stasi officers, had vanished into the fabric of the new, unified Germany. He had taken a generous early retirement package and disappeared. Finding him would be difficult. Proving a murder that had occurred a decade ago, in a country that no longer existed, based on a single microdot, would be nearly impossible. But Lucas now had what his father had lost, a purpose. His mother had not died a martyr for a failed state. She had died a detective, a real one, who had followed the truth to its bitter end. He owed it to her to finish her work. His investigation began not with the police, but back in the archives. He now knew what he was looking for. He searched for every file associated with Richter, every operation he had overseen. He found a pattern of failures, of compromised agents and blown missions, all cleverly blamed on others. He found travel manifests showing Richter's frequent trips to neutral cities like Vienna and Helsinki, trips that coincided with known meetings of MI6 handlers. And then he found the firearms registry. He looked up the serial number from the microdot, KR71-04. The registry showed the Makarov pistol had been issued to Colonel Klaus Richter in 1971. A report filed in April 1985, 7 months before his mother's murder, stated that the weapon had been lost during a training exercise. A replacement had been issued. The gun that killed his mother officially didn't exist. It was the final piece of the puzzle. Richter hadn't just killed her. He had planned it, creating the perfect cover story for the murder weapon months in advance. Lucas took his findings, the microdot, the archival research, the story of the lost gun, to a special unit of the federal police responsible for prosecuting crimes of the former GDR. He was met with skepticism. It was a cold case from another world. But a young, tenacious prosecutor named Hannah Vogel saw something in the intense, quiet young man and the incredible story he told. She saw the ghost of a case that demanded justice, no matter how much time had passed. The hunt for Klaus Richter and the ghost of his mother's Makarov had begun. Of course, here is the final section of the Berlin dossier. The search for Klaus Richter in the sprawling, unified Germany of the late 1990s was like hunting a ghost. Many former Stasi officers had created new lives, their pasts obscured by incomplete records and a collective desire to look forward, not back. Prosecutor Hannah Vogel, however, was undeterred. She and her small team of investigators, armed with Lucas Schmidt's meticulous research, began the painstaking process of tracking the former colonel's movements since the fall of the wall. They discovered he had been living a quiet, comfortable life. Using the funds he had received from his MI6 handlers, he had bought a secluded lakeside cottage in Mecklenburg, near the Polish border, under his wife's maiden name. He lived as a pensioner, known to his few neighbors as a reclusive but polite old man who spent his days fishing and tending his garden. The monster had become a retiree. In the autumn of 1998, 13 years after Anja Schmidt's murder, a team of federal police officers drove down the long, wooded lane to Richter's cottage. They found him on his porch, reading a newspaper, a cup of coffee steaming beside him. He was 68 years old, his hair white and thin, but his posture was still erect, his eyes still sharp and intelligent. He showed no surprise when they presented the warrant. He simply folded his newspaper neatly, took a slow sip of his coffee, and stood. "I suppose this was inevitable," he said, his voice calm, devoid of emotion. The search of his home was methodical. They found nothing. No hidden weapons, no incriminating documents. Richter was too smart for that. He had spent a lifetime erasing traces. In his study, they found framed photographs. One showed him shaking hands with Erich Mielke. Another showed him with his arm around a young, smiling Anja Schmidt at her graduation from the Stasi Academy. Lucas, who had accompanied the police against Vogel's advice, felt a wave of nausea. The investigators were about to give up when one of them, a young officer who had grown up on a farm, noticed something odd about the old stone fireplace. One of the hearthstones was newer than the others, its mortar a slightly different color. Using a crowbar, they pried it loose. Behind it, in a hollowed-out cavity, was a lead box. Inside the box, wrapped in oilcloth, was a 9x18mm Makarov pistol. The serial number was KR71-04. After 13 years, Anja Schmidt's ghost had returned. The ballistics test was a formality. Even after so many years, the unique striations etched onto the bullet pulled from Anja's skull were a perfect match to those created by test rounds fired from Richter's gun. The connection was absolute, a scientific certainty that bridged the gap between two different Germanys. Faced with the irrefutable evidence of the gun, Richter's composure finally broke. He agreed to talk. Over several days of interrogation, the full, sordid story of his betrayal emerged. His treason had begun in the late 1970s. Initially motivated by a need for money to pay for his wife's expensive, unsanctioned cancer treatments in the West, it had evolved into a cynical game of power. He sold secrets to MI6 not for ideology, but for the thrill of it, for the feeling of control it gave him over the system he served. Anja, his brilliant protégé, became his greatest threat. She was too good, Richter told the interrogators, his voice a dry rasp. "I taught her everything I knew, and she learned it all. She saw the patterns I was hiding. When she began Operation Cassiopeia, I knew it was only a matter of time." He had monitored her investigation from the beginning, using his authority to read her preliminary reports. When he realized she was closing in on him, he activated his plan. He reported his gun lost. He used his knowledge of her habits, her secret meeting places, to arrange the final encounter. "She trusted me completely," he said, a flicker of something, pride, or perhaps disgust, in his eyes. "She got in the car, ready to tell me about the traitor she had found. She never suspected it was me. It was easy." He recounted the murder with the detached precision of an after-action report. The single shot, the wiping of the surfaces, the collection of the casing, the removal of her real notes. He then took control of the investigation, framing the dissident Hess, whom he despised anyway, to close the loop. He had lived without remorse for 13 years. It was necessary, he concluded, his voice devoid of feeling. Her life or mine. The state, the cause, none of it mattered anymore. It was just survival. The trial of Klaus Richter in the spring of 1999 was more than just a murder trial. It was a post-mortem on the GDR itself. Held in Berlin, it captivated the nation, forcing Germans to confront the darkest aspects of the Stasi's legacy. The prosecution, led by Hannah Vogel, laid out the case with devastating clarity. They presented the ballistics, the archival evidence, and Richter's own chilling confession. But the most powerful testimony came from Lucas Schmidt, now a poised young historian. He took the stand and told the story of his mother, not as a Stasi major, but as a brilliant, dedicated woman who was murdered for her integrity by the man she trusted most. He looked directly at Richter, who refused to meet his gaze. "He didn't just kill my mother," Lucas said, his voice quiet but firm, echoing through the silent courtroom. "He corrupted her memory. He turned her into a prop for a lie he constructed to save himself. Justice for my mother isn't just about convicting him. It's about reclaiming her truth." The defense argued that Richter was a product of a criminal state, that his actions, while regrettable, should be understood in the context of the Cold War. But the jury was unmoved. The image of a mentor murdering his protege to cover his treason transcended politics. After deliberating for only a few hours, they returned a verdict, guilty of murder and treason. Klaus Richter was sentenced to life in prison. He showed no reaction as the sentence was read. He would die in a prison hospital 7 years later, an old, forgotten man. For Lucas and his father Stefan, the verdict was not a victory, but a release. The weight of unanswered questions, of a grief poisoned by lies, was finally lifted. Stefan, who had lived in fear for so long, could finally mourn his wife openly and honestly. The case had a lasting impact. It became a landmark in the legal reappraisal of the GDR's history, proving that even decades later, accountability was possible. It prompted a re-examination of other suspicious deaths and unsolved cases from the Stasi era, leading to several more cold cases being solved. Lucas Schmidt did not return to a quiet academic life. He established the Anja Schmidt Foundation, an organization dedicated to helping the families of victims of the Stasi regime and to preserving the memory of those who resisted its corruption from within. "My mother was a believer in a system that ultimately betrayed her," he said at the foundation's opening. "But she never betrayed her own principles. She followed the truth, even when it led to the heart of the darkness. Her true legacy is not as a Stasi officer, but as a truth seeker. That is a legacy that can inspire us all, regardless of what side of the wall we grew up on." In 2005, on the 20th anniversary of her death, a small, simple plaque was placed in Treptower Park, near the spot where her body was found. It did not mention the Stasi or the GDR. It read only, "Dr. Anja Schmidt, 1947 to 1985, murdered in the pursuit of truth." For the first time, her son could look at a memorial to his mother and know that it told no lies.